one of the most wonderful letters that John Adams ever wrote was a letter to his son, John Quincy, when John Quincy was a student at the university in the Netherlands. And he was encouraging him to work hard at his studies and to read what was being required by the university professors and the rest. He said, but keep reading poetry. And he said, this is a line I've never forgotten, you'll never be alone with a poet in your pocket. And I've not exactly lived up to having a poet in my pocket at all times, but I very rarely go anywhere without a book, and if possible, a book that I can literally carry in my pocket. And one such favorite of mine are the journals of Delacroix, Eugene Delacroix, the great French painter, which I was first told about by my old friend Paul Horgan, whose papers are here at Yale, wonderful writer and poet and artist. And he quoted one line from this journal which said, what Delacroix wrote, what I require is accuracy for the sake of imagination. And I thought, what a marvelous quote for an historian to keep in mind. Accuracy for the sake of imagination. Not imagination of making things up about what happened, but the imagination it takes to project yourself into another time, in another world. And just recently, rereading it, I came across a paragraph that I think applies absolutely perfectly to my friend Adam Van Doren and what you're about to see today. Now, this is an artist writing about history and historians. The historian's task appears to me to be the most difficult of all, because he needs to give unceasing attention to 101 things at the same time, and must preserve, through quotations, precise recitals of events and facts that are only relatively important, the enthusiasm that gives life to his story and makes it something more than an extract from the newspapers. What Adam has in excess, and certainly inexhaustible supply, is enthusiasm that gives life to his story. The enthusiasm with which he began writing me letters from his visits to the various houses that were once the homes of American presidents. Having never been to these historic sites before, and not just writing me about his reactions to them, but sending illustrated letters, absolutely spectacularly illustrated letters. And I looked at the first one, which was from Hyde Park, and I thought, what a treasure this letter is. And we got together a little later and started talking about, if he's been to Hyde Park, he's got to go to Sagamore Hill. If he goes to Sagamore Hill, he's got to go out to see Harry Truman's house in Independence, Missouri. And he was on his way not only just for this odyssey of presidential homes, but on his way to creating a book that's like none ever published before. This is a view of the presidential homes and the stories that go with them, such as never been written, never published, and it's a real landmark. And proud I am to have played a part in it. And isn't it wonderful? He's also turned out to be a fellow professor at Davenport College, which was my college. And of course, I'm very attached to anything that has to do with Davenport. So I'm going to kind of try to play interlocutor and make a few observations as we proceed. But I want to introduce you to the wondrous, enthusiastic, rare historian and friend, Adam Van Doren.
Thank you, David. Between the magic show and this, we can all go home now. Well, I can't imagine a better person and friend to write these letters, which you'll see in some detail here. Do I get the sound? Oops. Excuse me. Okay, thank you. I can't imagine a better person and friend to write these letters to. David, as I'm sure many of you know, is not someone who uses a computer often. He doesn't even have one. Email is not an option. David has famously typed all of his books on the same typewriter since 1961, and it's a typewriter that apparently comes from 1941, so that gives you a sense. But he and I share an affinity for letter writing and practicing our handwriting. He's got wonderful handwriting as well, and I joked at one event like this that he and I are the sort of people that when we write letters, we like to write out the entire word Massachusetts when we put on the, so we can practice the whole thing. But it started with a few of these letters, as David said, and his enthusiasm, which was infectious, maybe increased the volume of these letters and make them longer and longer. I've done these little doodles and things for friends over the years, but never with that excitement on the other end that David had. So it became something very organic, if you will, a word they use now for art. And it was such an exciting thing for me. And as you may well know, the illustrated letter is an art form in itself, not common, certainly these days, with email, but from Max Beerbohm to Beatrix Potter to George Grosz to even Teddy Roosevelt wrote illustrated letters to his grandkids, which are not included in this show, but you can look those up. So without further ado, we're going to proceed with some of these homes, not all of them, it would be too long an afternoon. And these are actually, I think, for the most part, in chronological order. In the book, they're not. They're based on the chronology of when I went to these homes, because I jotted around the country. And one last thing, the book includes one sort of more formal portrait, as you see here, of the home that I chose. I did several paintings of the homes when I went out there. And then there's illustrated letters to follow. I spent 3 or 4 days at each of these places, and immersing yourself in history in that way, and physically, and in this tangible way, is something that Dave and I share an affinity for. It's, especially in this day and age when you can take a virtual tour of an historic house like this on a web page, presumably, fascinating, interesting, but nothing compares to actually being there, holding the banister that Thomas Jefferson held when he went up the stairs at Monticello, being in the kitchen, walking on the linoleum floor at Harry Truman's house. Those, if you will, historic DNA that permeates these homes is something you never forget. And if one has the luxury to spend time at any of these places, I urge you to spend maybe more than just the 1 hour tour, but maybe staying overnight and really get to know the place and feel the spirit that comes through. So here we go. We're going to start with George Washington. This is, of course, Mount Vernon. And for those of you who are artistically inclined or interested in this sort of thing, this is a style that I've done in several of my paintings in the book, where I'm using a paper that's already colored. The paper itself is sort of an olive green. It's a traditional technique that's been used for hundreds of years until the last 60 or 70, when everyone uses white paper to really start with. But it allows you to work off of a ground, so to speak. And the white that you see is actually gouache. The rest of it is watercolor. But sort of a backwards approach. But for those of you interested in watercolor, and the ones I teach here at Yale to students, I introduce that technique. But Washington doesn't get enough credit, I would say, for being an architect, for all intents and purposes. Jefferson, of course, is known for obsessing for decades on his house on Monticello, but Washington was perhaps not as obsessive, but pretty obsessive. And down to the wall coverings and the furniture and the chimney fronts. There were many additions to this home that he inherited from his wife's family, but there are plenty of letters where he talks to the contractors, or whatever they were called back then, builders, of how he'd like his house done. And this, of course, is a view also on that toned paper of the famous back porch or veranda that he designed, which has become a prototype, aside from the Ramada Inn and places like that, for a certain kind of grand porch that is one of his innovations in architecture. This is a view of the, if some of you have been to Monticello, some of the small outbuildings that surround the estate and give a sense of a little village. Some of them are smokehouses, some of them are places for making leather saddles and things like that. And they add a complexity to the whole place, which is quite extraordinary. Now, this is a sample of these illustrated letters, if you will. And as I say, I upped the ante a bit and got more and more color in there. And this is a view, of course, of Monticello, as you see from the approach.
Imagine opening up a letter like that, knowing it's nobody else has ever received that letter. Nobody else will ever receive it. There's no letter like it anywhere. And, well, it goes on and on. I think one of the most interesting, this porch really is more important than people realize, in that you said it was an innovation. But the fact that he didn't put the cupola in the middle of the roof, he never wrote an autobiography. And that house is his autobiography. And his story is in there. He believed that appearances in a leader were essential. And he cared about every detail of his uniform, of his clothing, of his coach, of the house, everything. And he knew what he was doing.
And I think there's one quote which is in the frontispiece of the book that said, "I'd rather be at my home," and I'm paraphrasing, "my home at Mount Vernon than be emperor of the world." So
yeah.
This was his great passion. This, I mentioned in this letter, this back porch also had significance to me in a way going back again to spending time at a location. I visited the slave quarters that are on the estate and saw where the slaves lived, which were on bunk beds with hay and the equivalent of plywood or whatever, if that. And as I walked around for 2 or 3 days in the hot July sun in Virginia, you can only imagine, humid, looking for places to paint with very little shade, not that many trees on the estate around the house. I looked forward to the times when I could sit on that porch and get the breeze and the cool air. And I thought to myself, you know, slaves did not have a chance to get any of that refreshing moment of peace and breeze. They were supposed to work from dawn till dusk. And sometimes 7 days a week, there are notes of 80-year-old slaves still doing that. So that became very poignant, just in a very visceral way. This is, of course, another view of the home. This is the cover of the book.
If I just interrupt, look at the way he's moved the window. The windows are not even, and there's the space between them you can see. And these little quirks of personality, if you will, or lack of monotony, are very important. And he had that eye, that gift.
Yes.
And we don't think of him as being a creative architect at all. He was.
I mean, how he had time, not as if Jefferson would have time, but you associate somebody who's in the military to have less time.
Yeah.
It's a story that still needs to be told in more detail. This is, again, what David was talking about, the placement of windows and the slight asymmetry of the cupola.
Cupola's off center from the peak of the middle of the roof. It's fascinating.
And
almost no one notices it unless you point it out.
Right.
And you weren't supposed to notice it.
That's right. So, moving on. Thomas Jefferson, of course, is well known as a architecturally minded figure. This is one of the famous views from the back of the house. For those of you who don't know, he did spend famously 40 years of his life adding this, that, and the other thing, obsessing, changing, studied Palladio. But what's remarkable is when I studied architecture is that Jefferson is noted with the 4 buildings or 5 buildings that he did as being a transformative figure in the history of American architecture. That's how significant he was. You can't quite say that about Washington to that respect, but not only Monticello, but of course the University of Virginia. He designed the state capitol in Virginia and a couple other buildings. And what he combined was this vernacular, Virginia architecture of the bricks of the farmhouse with this very high style of Roman classical traditional architecture, Palladian architecture, combining that. So it really created an American architecture that was really not existent in America at the time. They were basically copies of European architecture if you did a classical building, but nothing that really combined something that was indigenous to America. So that's one of his great contributions. This is a side view of the house, again done on that more colored paper, but not a view that you generally see. And I thought it was very interesting because the massing is very complex, and it shows you sophistication that Jefferson had with designing this building. This is the front, less famous perhaps because it's not on the back of the nickel like the back, but some of this, people say, how come you don't quite finish these watercolors? It's very interesting, but what is the reason for that? Well, I tell them to some extent, when you're working on plein air, like I do, or as I do, after 3 hours, your butt starts tired, and you want to move on, or the sun changes, or it's time for lunch, or David McCullough is on the cell phone. He has a cell phone. But there's also something that's very gratifying about focusing in when you have a short amount of time and you don't know what's going to come up next, is to go for the essence of what you want to paint, whether it's a still life or anything, or a person. In this case, it's home. So you hone in on that, and the rest is gravy, and it spills out. And if it ends at that point, you can say, and I almost never come back to the house or to that view again. I feel like that was the moment, and let's leave it at that. And the moment's changed. The moment's gone. This is one of the letters to David. That could have been another title for the book, Letters to David, of Jefferson's house. This is all of these wonderful instances of this bursting intellect that Jefferson was, and this famous divan that he sat on, which had a table on it with candles where you could read. I mean, he obviously wanted to maximize every moment of his life to tackle all the interests that he had. And I quote myself right now by saying I thought of him as like Leonardo da Vinci of American history, partly because I felt like, and David and I have talked about this, that here's a man who was obsessive about details, down to every nail that he ever had manufactured on his property, every seed, that he grew, every slave that he had. So with that kind of mind, how could it also be a mind that's thought on such a large, broad, abstract scale as great ideas? Usually those two kinds of mindsets don't come from the same person. Do you agree?
I agree. He kept track of every dime, dollar he ever spent and what he spent it on, but he never added it up. No, he didn't. And he was always, always in debt. Never was out of debt. He put his house up on top of that hilltop, the most impractical place imaginable. Everything had to be hauled up there, again, by slave labor. And everything had to be hauled back down, that they produced, hauled back down to the river, where it would then go on a barge to market. But that didn't concern him.
No.
I think also his use of open space with buildings, and particularly at the University of Virginia, the lawn campuses, which I suspect he learned in part during his time in France.
Mm.
Yep.
Yes, that is still a remarkable campus for that respect. And there's also a lot of whimsy in the home. This is I did a rendering here of this famous bed. It's never been done in architecture before or since, as far as I know, where the bed opens up on two rooms. And he wanted to be able to be free, depending on how he felt that morning, to wake up and be in the study, or wake up in whatever the other room was, a more casual room. He wanted to feel like he wanted to tackle astronomy that morning, or he just felt he wanted to sit and read, People magazine, or whatever the equivalent was. He allowed himself those two options. So it's a lot of very personal features in the home. This is a little pavilion on the estate where he spent his early days with his young wife while the house was being built, and they had to have a place to stay. Another view from the side of the house, again showing that interesting massing that's not often appreciated. Moving on, you get 2 for 1 here, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. We'll focus more on John Adams, of course, David's great subject in one of his recent books. These 2 homes, this is John Adams Sr., but John Adams, the same John Adams, was born just a mile away in a house that still exists in a small salt box where John Quincy Adams was also born. This house is not quite as grand as Jefferson's and Washington's. Very stately, doesn't have a huge portico or massive columns. This was a different man in many respects. One thing that David has pointed out a number of times is that Adams was the only founding father that did not choose to have slaves. He was not as wealthy as the other 2, but he had money. He could have had 10, 12 slaves.
No.
Okay.
Well, he could have had a few, but he was adamantly against it, and Abigail was even more so. And we should remember that there were many Americans long before the Civil War who were adamantly against slavery. And I think it's a shame that this one founding father who was against slavery has no memorial or any tangible tribute to him in our nation's capital. Nothing. There's not a statue, not a building, nothing.
Great mystery, isn't it?
It is. But I think it's stressed that this is not as grand a house as it would appear in Adam's wonderful rendering. Can we move on to there? And the rooms inside, this part of it, there was a wing put on later on that made it much larger. But to go through that house and realize that everything in it is the real thing, everything, and several generations, it's thrilling. And some very tragic moments occurred in that house.
You described one instance, I guess, with Abigail and John's daughter, was that it?
Yes. On the second floor, she had a mastectomy in her bedroom, performed by 2 doctors from Boston. They'd come out from Boston. And her mother and father had to stand in the hall outside the bedroom with the door closed. That same door is there, the same bedroom, the same hall. And she was having that mastectomy without any anesthetic. So I'm always annoyed in the extreme when I hear people on television talk shows saying, well, you have to realize that was a simpler time. No, pal, it was not a simpler time. It was much rougher than you have any idea. And when Tom Hanks was going to proceed with his wonderful HBO production of John Adams, I said, you must not let it become a costume pageant. You must show the dirt and the grit and the suffering and the reality of bad teeth and mastectomies without anesthetic. We are so fortunate to have so many benefits that we take for granted. And I think that's one of the lessons of history, why history is so important for all of us to appreciate. Have you got the house where he grew up?
Yes, I'll just mention this was a wonderful quote to show the humility of this man. It stands outside the front of the house. It is but the farm of a patriot. That's a quote of John Adams. These are little caricatures that I sent
wonderful.
Abigail, John Quincy at the top, who was an extremely handsome man. I've seen portraits by famous painters. Maybe there's one here.
I think he may have had the highest IQ of anybody who's ever been president. He was brilliant in the extreme.
There's a letter that I mentioned at one of these events when he wrote when he was 9.
Yeah.
It's so precocious and so extraordinary. It's worth looking up. You cannot believe a 9-year-old writes this letter saying to his father, I can't finish Cicero tonight because I'm reading Aristotle. But
didn't you write letters like that
to
your
did.
parents?
You and I did, but that's But it's dated, so you know how old he was. This is a view of some of the furniture in the room. This is a view of in the earlier salt box, which shows when he had set up his law office, he had a little podium. I don't have an outside view in this one, but you want to talk about the salt boxes? Or?
No, just to say that Adam's childhood, boyhood was about this equal in terms of what he didn't have as Abraham Lincoln. We should remember that because so many of these founders were affluent from birth. And Adam's mother was illiterate, almost for sure. If there was a book in the house, it was the Bible, it was the only book. He had to work hard on the farm, and he succeeded in having a scholarship to go to Harvard, but we shouldn't think of Harvard as the great university it is today. Harvard was a little college with about faculty of 7 and maybe 100 students. But as he said, I discovered books and I read forever. And how true it was. We have to not only read what they wrote, we have to read what they read. Very, very important. And you're coming up to a very important reader here, this guy.
Yes.
This is one of my favorite letters from Adam describing his visit to Sagamore Hill.
We'll get to it in 2 seconds. This is an outside view of that house, which has just been restored. National Park Service, tax dollars at work, spent $6 million restoring this house on Long Island. Another view, it's a marvelous shingle-style house. Not many people know that Roosevelt was a great aesthete himself and hired one of the great shingle-style architects of the day to design this house, which is an incredibly beautiful example of the shingle style. This is a view of a beech tree that I wanted to capture with the shade on the house, which is, for those of you who are painters, is a technical kind of effort that's not easy to pull off to get a transparent shadow on the side of a building. But here's the letters that came to David, and I even had a little floor plan in this. This is the den where Teddy spent a lot of his time and has his portraits of his ancestors. And, of course, he's famous for having all of these, apropos of this earlier drawing of moose heads and whatnot. So it all ties in. There's a lot of magic here. Elephant tusks, not the sort of things you associate with someone whose family founded the Natural History Museum, or maybe you would. But he was a famous preservationist, of course, and helped found the national parks. This is, I think, the story that David's referring to. It's one of the things that happens when you're on site at a place like this. I was painting away, and hot, as usual. It always seems to be hot when I'm painting. And looking up at the house, the Long Island Sound behind me, and I'm usually, people come up to me while I paint and make comments like, hey, I could do better than that. Or, how much do you want for that? You know. So I usually just zone out because you're trying to focus. This particular day, somebody came up from behind me and said, good job, good job. And I kept working. Then I looked behind me, and there was this man dressed up exactly as Teddy Roosevelt would have been dressed up. So you can imagine I'm thinking, okay, maybe the sun has gotten to me. And you do this double. I was not expecting this at all. This is, as you might now imagine, was these people at some of these great homes, not many of them, but actors who volunteer to, you know.
Reenactors,
Reenactors.
And some of them are so on the dot that you think, oh, my God, it is Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, the knickers and the whole business. So that was an unexpected pleasure, and I can't guarantee that you'll
That's
see.
his version of the story. The other is that maybe he had been out in the sun too much.
Yeah, that's right. We'll never know. Man named Foote. I'll give him some credit, or credit's due. F-O-O-T-E. I don't know if he still does it. Now, and this, I'll just say that the choice of some of these houses was not, full disclosure, not totally comprehensive, but there's a limit to how many places you can go around the country and spend 4 days. But I tried to mix it up. David and I talked about that. One of them, we thought, hey, do somebody that's not known as well. And Calvin Coolidge is not on everyone's lips right away as a great person, certainly not known for his charisma. Well, I found him in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, which is a very small town in northern Vermont. And maybe some of you have been. I happened to go with my son in the middle of 2 feet of snow. It's a little village that's almost comprised entirely of Calvin Coolidge-related homesteads. But it was a great example of going to a place and not only physically seeing it, but just feeling it. The weather was just chilly, freezing, and most of the time I was there. And here's a version of the home. The little brown structure is just behind the main structure, which was a general store that his father ran. And he grew up in that little brown extension just behind it with no heat of any kind. It had one stove in the kitchen that was supposed to heat the entire house. The tour guide that gave me a tour said it could sometimes be 30 below in the winter, and not a whole lot of heat, but not a whole lot of people even in the town to socialize with and whatnot. So you can see why somebody like that is known for a lack of charisma, if you will. Dorothy Parker had a famous line about Calvin Coolidge that goes something like, when she found out he had died, she said, "How could they tell?" But when you have no one to talk to but livestock and your parents, it explains something. This is I did a little drawing of a famous scene in American history where Calvin Coolidge, if some of you have forgotten, was a vice president before he was a president. And Harding died in office. But where was Calvin Coolidge? He was in Vermont. And they had to find him, middle of nowhere. And how to inaugurate him as president, or at least officiate him as president. So they got his father, who was a justice of the peace in this town of 8 people. And there's a little table still there where the father had him put his hand on a Bible or something to make him the next president. This is just a picture of Coolidge's room, which I purposely showed. There's no heat source. Right up to a window that's drafty and damn near froze to death. This is a view of the house he moved to across the street from the house he was born in, the big house. So it's a very tiny place. Now, moving on to a relative of Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. Hyde Park, right up the Hudson River. I went there by train, as I went to many of these sites. I enjoyed trains. David, I think, does too. That's how you came up to New Haven, didn't you? From Boston?
Always.
Always. or down from Boston. This view is the view that most people see of this very formal entrance, very symmetrical. It's not always the view that you see in the back, which is the view that I chose for the book, which is a much more rambling, asymmetrical view, which is taken from below in the Hudson River looking up. And I thought that was an interesting perspective.
Well, I'd just like to interrupt him and say that I've never seen that view of Hyde Park. And once I saw this drawing and painting, I realized that Adam really has an eye like nobody else. It's a brilliant painting which evokes the grandeur of not just the architectural achievement, but of the importance of this figure in our story as a nation. And
we should also note that this was his mother's house. And it was his mother's house, I believe, until she died. So when he and Eleanor, Franklin and Eleanor, were living in this house, the mother was upstairs, and Eleanor was constantly reminded of the mother-in-law. There's a very formidable portrait of Sarah Roosevelt on the first floor, and David and I have talked about that, where you can imagine Eleanor coming to the breakfast table and walking by this portrait.
Having to face that formidable reminder every day.
And I think in the house...
She went with them wherever they went.
Those kind of cartoons where you see the eyes moving in the portrait. I think also remarkably, from what I remember, that the house in New York, Sarah moved next door,
Yeah.
and made a connection between the homes.
Put a door through the side so that you couldn't
So she
close
was
her
never
out.
far. This again is using that different colored paper, and I chose the white of the gouache for a few areas in the front. And an artist teacher of mine once told me, when you do this technique, you can't put white all over the place, or it's going to look like it's snowing. So you have to be very selective and save the whitest whites to come in with the gouache. This is a version of the stables where Eleanor kept her favorite horses. She was a big rider. Franklin, of course, couldn't ride.
Wonderful building.
Thank you.
Wonderful painting.
Right next to the main house.
It's a mansion in itself.
Yes.
Yeah, really.
That's when barns were barns, right?
Yeah.
And you can actually hear an audio tape of Eleanor that is still in the house, in that stables, about the tour of the place. She used to give an audio tour by cassette of the whole house, but now it's just the stables. And in that wispy kind of aristocratic voice that she had, it's very entertaining. This is a view. I don't always get a chance to paint on the inside of a house because you don't want to get paint on the floor and whatnot. And I had to have a park ranger sit with me the whole time. But I wanted to get that famous rocking chair, what am I saying, the wheelchair that Roosevelt had fashioned out of a existing chair so it wouldn't look like a wheelchair. And amazingly, nobody in the country knew he was an invalid. It's still astonishing. I mean, it wasn't, the Ice Age. It was still the 30s, but most people didn't know they had that so well concealed. Another view of FDR's place from the side. I threw in a couple of caricatures once in a while. This is a car that he had designed to maneuver using the fact that his legs had no strength from polio. So they had somehow geared this so he could ride it. This is a little map I drew of the Hudson River showing a lot of the towns that had Dutch heritage. Franklin Roosevelt was very, very proud of his ancient American heritage, ancient by our standards.
Now this, I kind of hasten to add, remind you, this isn't something he's doing for a book. This is a letter to a friend, and he's going to all this detail and labor. And I felt, what am I accumulating here? Truly a collection of infinite value and importance. But keep going because I think this is what really shows what kind of a guy he is. Those are the little bells for the house, for the servants of which room is sending down requests for their service.
Yeah, it's dining hall, left bedroom, kitchen, and so forth. Well, in a nutshell, you get a sense of the privilege.
You get a sense of what kind of a place you're in.
Yeah. Another view from the side of that same estate. Now, another of David's great subjects, Harry Truman. Independence, Missouri. This is a view in the fall that I did. One of the things that struck me, again, now if you saw, let's say, a photograph of this or maybe a painting, you might have no idea that this is on a tiny lot. There's no front backyard to speak of for a man of such distinction. But when you go to Independence, you realize the houses are cheek to jowl, and this is actually his in-laws' home that he and Bess lived in. But what's great about this house is one of the best examples, besides Washington's and Jefferson's, where the articles of this person are still there. The furniture, the books, the objet d'art are all intact. And David was the one who made sure that I spent time in the kitchen because he loved the fact that the cracked linoleum is just the way it was when the Trumans were there. And even there's a little calendar on the above the chair that you may not make out, but that Bess Truman would cross out the dates every day. And they had to the last day, 1982, when she died, she outlived him by 10 years, of the last day that she crossed out. But you can have a sense that the Trumans are right there. They don't even paint the room that often, if they even paint it at all, so that you have a feeling of their presence. This is walking around Independence. He was famous for walking. I should note that he came back to independence after the presidency with no pension, no real money to speak of. And he thought he'd go home in peace and anonymity. Is that the right word? Little did he know, this is a picture of his daughter, Margaret, which I will get to. He comes back to his home and thinks, he could live a life of quiet and privacy. What he doesn't realize is the beginning of, I guess, what we call celebrity culture. He was a celebrity. People went to find him. And the interstate highway system was developing. And unlike FDR a few years before, where you didn't know even that he was an invalid, people knew about Harry Truman and what he looked like. And they followed out on trips and the vacations to that home to see if they could see him. And they went as far as taking pieces of his lawn, taking pieces of the house as souvenirs. And he was shocked completely, as you might imagine, and had to actually build a wrought iron fence around the house that the government paid for. He didn't have the money, which was terribly disheartening to him to be in a hometown where he had to close himself off. But there was little choice. Now, Margaret was their only child, and they were extremely close as a unit. There's a famous story that's true that is noted in this letter. I'm sure you can't really read it from there, but she was an aspiring singer, and he was very protective of her, and she got a terrible review in the New York Times for her performance. And he famously wrote Harry Truman to the New York Times and said, or to the critic in the paper who wrote that review, saying, "I've never met you, but if I do, you'll need a new nose." His advisors told him, don't write that, you're the president. He said, I don't care, Margaret came back late in life. Her parents were long dead, and these park rangers, which is, again, experiences David knows of talking to the park rangers and getting to know them. They have a lot of intimate connection to the properties. They remember, one of them remembers when she came back in her old age, and it was just overwhelming for her. It was very hard to even spend more than an hour there. She was overcome with her memories of her parents. And this is the Harry Truman Library, which is only a mile away in this 50s style architecture. Amazingly, he actually worked there. He needed the money, and he, I think, was paid by the government to answer the phones.
He, I think it's a good point to be reminded of. He, as Adam said, retired with no presidential pension, and he had very little money. He had some earnings from his autobiography. And he refused to take any fees for speeches or to serve on any boards for big, fat fees or to make phone calls for lobbying of any kind, because he said that would be disgracing the office of the presidency. Imagine. When he heard that the Kennedy campaign was going to have $1,000 a plate dinners to raise money, he said, there goes democracy. And now both parties have $50,000 a plate dinners. I'm going to vote for Harry Truman in 2016.
Oh, well, David's got a great line about his father's, who was, I guess, a moderate Republican, and was very upset when Dewey lost. But do you want to tell that story?
Well, I tried to stay awake that night in 1948. I was 15 in high school, and I was very interested in politics and anxious to know who won, but I couldn't stay awake, as some of you may remember, the final count didn't come in until about 2 in the morning. So the next morning, my father was in shaving, and I went in and said, Dad, who won? He said, Truman, like it was the end of the world. And so 25, 30 years went by, and I was back in Pittsburgh visiting my father, and after dinner we had a nice talk about this and that. And he started in on how the world was going to hell and the country was going to hell. And then he paused and he said, too bad old Harry isn't still in the White House. So our view of these people does change with time.
This is a view which you can sort of see in the foreground, lightly articulated, but the wrought iron fence that wraps around the house. Now we're going to head over and jump the years to JFK. It's a little faint on the slide. This was an example of our collaboration. I went to Brookline to paint the house where John F. Kennedy was born. A modest lot, it's a simple house, but it's part of the National Park Service. And I spent time there a whole afternoon, went to Boston, and I told David, or wrote to him, and said, I've done John F. Kennedy now, as I checked off my list. And he said, where'd you go? And I said, well, the house in Brookline. He said, okay, that's good. But, you know, he only lived there for about 3 or 4 years. So if you think about it, that doesn't really give you a real sense of who he was, or doesn't impact so much on his personality as a figure. What you really need to do is go to Hyannisport, where Rose and Joe's, his parents' house, where he spent so many summers and was so connected to. That's, you'll really get a sense of John F. Kennedy. I said, okay, well, how do you do that? It's still owned by the family. And he said, well, write them a letter, see what happens. You can use my name or not. Anyway, I did write them, and it's long story short, I did get access to the house in Hyannis. And we'll get to that in a second. I want to just finish with the house in Brookline. It's a modest 3-story house, and even a smaller lot than Harry Truman's. Joe Kennedy was an aspiring bank executive, and this is the little tree-lined street in Brookline. And didn't make a whole lot of money in the first few years, but gradually, of course, he became extremely wealthy. This is a wonderful vignette that I remember of the house which was bought back by the National Park Service 50 years after the Kennedys moved out. The Park Service bought it from the other family, and they got Rose Kennedy to return and redecorate it as she remembered it in 1917 when they left. But one of the touching things is in this dining room, to the right of this little table by the window, which is only about 2 feet high, is the main dining room table. Not vast, but seats 6 or 7 people. And that's where the adults ate. But they created a small-scale version of that exact same dining room for John F. Kennedy and Joe Kennedy, his older brother, who he worshipped. And they were meant to sit beside the main table and experience what it was like to be a little adult, and to learn how to use napkin rings and knives and forks and the proper ways to have table manners, not put you up in a high chair with a sippy cup the way we do today. So it's very touching just to imagine the two of them as 6 and 8-year-olds. Of course, Joe died tragically, but to be there and to witness that, I think is worth the trip. Now we're heading to Hyannisport. And Ed, I believe his name is, well, I know his last name is Shea, S-H-E-A, works for the Edward Kennedy Institute and a liaison with the family. He met me there and gave me a tour of the house in Cape Cod, much grander, of course. Another view of it in the illustrated letter. One of the fun things was that a view inside, Mr. Shea said, Jim is his name, would you like to see the attic? And I said, oh, sure, I'd love to. Feeling I had real special access, you know. So we went up to the attic, and there was chock full of family artifacts and objects, rolled up rugs, all with name tags from every room, the wheelchair that Rose had and the wheelchair that Joe had when he was older, right next to each other, an old television from 1950, books, of course, stacked high, and that was fascinating. I did another caricature of John F. Kennedy here.
On attics, I went up into the attic at the Truman House with one of the National Park Service people when I was doing research for my book. And it was just like any family attic with all this different stuff, but right in the middle of the floor was a huge laundry basket, wicker laundry basket, about the size of these little tables here, packed, overflowing with bottles of champagne. And there are bottles of champagne all over the floor, too, unopened. And obviously, they didn't like champagne. And people were giving him champagne all the time. Up to the attic could go. And you may remember when Truman first came back from the White House, and he got off the train, and the reporter was at the house and said, well, what's the first thing you're going to do, Mr. President? He said, take the grips up to the attic. So there was a reality about him that was wonderful.
Now, he also, this gentleman said, would you like to see the basement? I said, well, okay. Ready for some more surprises? And there, in fact, was a surprise. When we got down, he showed me a room that Joe Kennedy had set up, the first home theater in America. This was in the 20s, where he had first-run films that he had sent from Hollywood. He invested in Hollywood films in those days. And he showed his family, or his friends, these on a projected screen with old projectors that are still there. I mean, they don't work anymore. They're all covered with dust. But what a vision. It's commonplace today, I guess, if you live in a big McMansion, but certainly not then. And just a side piece to that, Joe Kennedy made part of his fortune from investing in what were called talkies. Everyone said, there's no way in hell you're going to make any money on talkie films, that there's not going to be a smooth transition at all. It's hard to believe that was the thought at the time, but it was, and of course, he was right, and he made a fortune. But I can't say everyone can get into the Hyannisport house, but you can see the house in Brookline, and it's a worth visit. Now, we go to something that, as we're getting close to the end, for those of you who got important lunch dates, to what David, when I spoke to him somewhat in the project, he said, well, Adam, these are great, the houses you've done, but have you ever done any living presidents? And I said, okay, again, how does one do that? Write a letter, you know. So there are not a whole lot of choices. There's four. There was four then. First one I tackled was George H.W. Bush, class of 1950, no, he's older than you.
No.
1940s.
Right after the war.
Yeah. And at Yale, at Davenport College, where David went and where I teach. I got a wonderful letter back from them saying, by all means, come to Kennebunkport, the house that I was interested in. They weren't going to be there, but I had access to the Secret Service to paint on the outside, and it was November, just close to December. Not the ideal time to go paint anything, but when somebody says you can come up there, I jumped on it. And this is a view that you see when you enter the house. Some of you can see that from the mainland if you look out with binoculars on this compound on Walker's Point. A shingle-style house that's been added on over the years, but is, I don't know if you can see this in the slide. It's got a lot of rambling gables. I did this view from the water looking up on this rocky cliff. And one of the Secret Service came out at one point concerned because they said, just want to make sure you realize that your back is to the water and the tide rises in about 2 hours, so your paints and your whole being is going to be submerged if you're not keeping an eye. And I looked behind me, and sure enough, the water that was here is now here. There I am.
Yeah.
Taking advantage of winter gear to paint this home with my Dickens-like gloves because it was very cold. But it's an experience I'll never forget. And, of course, I was there all day and imagining what went on in that house from Putin to Gorbachev to God knows who else was there, to family members. It goes back 100-odd years in the family. I should add that, as we'll get to it in the next slide, this is another view that you can see more or less from the mainland. The Bushes wrote me wonderful letters. I also sent them a copy of an actual original painting of the house that they apparently framed and hung in Houston at their place they live most of the time. This is a view of Kennebunkport, just in the environs, another view of the house. And then I should add, as we get to it next, this photograph. This is a typical conversation David and I have. It's always magic when I talk to David McCullough. I was in Martha's Vineyard, where he has a house this summer, and he calls me up and he says, Adam, I'm going to visit my old friend George Bush. And I thought, why not give him a gift of your book? And would that be okay? And I said, by all means. So David went up with Tim Lawson, son-in-law, also a wonderful painter, and they went up, and I was not there, but I imagined what was going to happen. Were they going to get there? Were they actually going to give him the book? And the true friend he called me the next day, and he told me the whole detail, how the Bushes loved seeing the book, and his wife, Rosalie, read some passages from the book, and Tim took a photo of it, which is what I've included here. So it's a very touching moment, and I can't say I was there, but I can see what it was like. This leads me now. Oh, you wanted to say one great quote, which I always like, about the father and your sense of the presidents that you've known over many years. Do you want to talk about that one reference to, I think, taking a car ride from Maine to...
Oh, I've known, I think it's 7 of the presidents. Some I spent a great deal of time with, others less time. But I felt that I know them as people. And if I had to drive from New Haven to St. Louis with one of them, it would be George H.W. Bush, because he's absolutely wonderful man, human being. And he's real. And he's got humor, and he's kind, and he's thoughtful. And John Meacham has a new book out about him, which I highly recommend, because it's giving Bush Sr. credit that's overdue as a president of some importance and admirable in how he conducted himself as a leader and as a man. I highly recommend it.
Well, after I did George Sr.'s house, forgotten all the details, I won't bore you with all those, but the son thought, well, why don't you come to our house? And there was Crawford, Texas, where I went on my next assignment for this book. And combine 2 stories in one. I went actually a couple of times for this experience, but on the second time he thought, well, if you don't mind, it'd be nice if you gave me a painting lesson when you come next time, if you would like. He was very discreet about it and generous, but I said, sure. I'm sure many of you know he's taken up painting as a serious interest of his. He does it all the time now. And so I spent 3 nights there at the ranch. This is a house. I showed just one detail of it. What was fun about doing this, it's very different from the other homes. It's very modern. Actually, very well designed. I met the architect who was doing some other additions to the place. Very ecologically friendly, very sustainable. You know, again, these aren't things that you associate with the Bushes or George W. Ironically, Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth and all of that has a house that apparently could light up the Western Hemisphere. I'm not playing politics. I mean, we agreed that this book wasn't going to be about politics. It was going to be about homes. But it's interesting that you wouldn't know this, of course, unless you went to these places. But another view of the house. This is what happens when you arrive at this 2,500-acre ranch. There's a huge concrete barrier comes out that says stop in case you can't read. And the Secret Service met me, and very cordial. Of course, they checked for bombs under the car, for those of you who experience this sort of thing. But then initially I didn't know what to expect because they don't tell you a whole lot, and I was always done through a liaison, secretary stuff. But I went up the long driveway with the Secret Service and met Laura at the front door, which is very nice. And this is a vision of Crawford, which was a tiny town, I mean, literally the size of this room. But I had overall an extraordinary experience, and this, of course, the ultimate in this project of experiencing history, because you actually meet the president. Again, if politics is not something that you're obsessed about, and you can understand this from the perspective of a man who, in my case, was extremely cordial. We got to know each other within, I'd say, 4 hours on a very close basis, partly because he didn't make me feel as if I was at some level and he was at another level. We shared an interest in art. That's what connected us. We didn't really talk politics. He was interested in art. Eventually, we talked about history and whatnot. But that was our connection. And he was a very good student. I gave him a course, a crash course in watercolor medium he hadn't really worked on. He'd done oils or has done oils. And I said, George, which I was calling him at the time, I said, I'm going to give you in 3 days what I give my students at Yale in 13 weeks. Is that okay? And he said, fine, let's go. And he's a very, very good painter. And not all of his stuff is at the same level, but there's a lot that's quite extraordinary. And maybe someday you'll see an edited version of all of that, who knows, in a book or a gallery show. But he's very committed to it and spends most of each day doing it. He had a studio that was being built at the time. One funny story about this is that I was in the guest house, which is about 300 yards from the main house, and I said to George, I said, because there's a very nice painting there, and I said, God, you know, is that a Rockwell Kent in the house, in the guest house? It's right next to my bed. It's a very nice painting. He said, no, but you can take a look at it. There's the signature on it. So I went back that night by myself, and I was looking, where's the signature on this thing? I thought I'd losing my mind, or maybe he had mixed up the paintings. Then at the very end, I noticed in the corner it said 43. That's his signature for himself.
We're in this magnificent Yale gallery, and the whole world of art is with us here. When Eisenhower was about to take command for the invasion of Normandy and arrived in England, Churchill took him aside and said to him, do you have some kind of thing you like to do when you're not working that relieves your mind of the worries or tensions that build up in with your responsibilities? And he said, no, I don't. He said, well, you better find one, and I highly recommend painting because it takes your mind completely off of everything else. And if you don't have something like this, you're going to crack, because the tension and responsibility you're about to bear is more than any one human being can handle. So Eisenhower took up the painting, and he did it for the rest of his life. Now, he never achieved the level of performance that Churchill did. Churchill was very good. And I think that one of the joys of painting is you don't have to use any words. Hey, nanny, nanny. Yeah. And I'm sure for President Bush, it's the same effect. Tony Bennett paints. Katharine Hepburn painted. Morley Safer's a wonderful painter. There's lots of
David McCullough painted.
Well, I've always done it. I really highly recommend it. And you don't have to have been accomplished at it. Every course in painting that I could take as an undergraduate, or life drawing, or the rest here, I did. And I've been painting ever since. And I think also that anyone who aspires to be a serious writer should take a drawing or painting course, or more than one, because it teaches you to see, to really look at things in a way that you don't otherwise. And that's a writer's job, to help the reader to see what happened and was happening. Dickens said, "Make me see." So these people who really do it, like Adam and my son-in-law, Tim Lawson, they really do see. Every time I go out to paint with Tim Lawson, and he's good enough to let me come along, we go sketching outdoors, and I work as hard as I can, and then I stop and take a look at what he's done. I think, whoa, no, truly. And the hard work that goes into it, I think it was Ted Williams said the hardest part of, he had famous easy swing. He said the hardest part of it all is making it look easy. And that's true of every line of work. And so when you see these letters that are being dashed off by this incredible man, you think, oh, isn't that easy? No, it's not. And he didn't get there by doing nothing.
Thank you. He's a wonderful painter. He's very modest, but I've seen his work, and hopefully you will at some point. Just wrapping up, we got one more, and then we're on. Off, rather. This was just a funny last page of one of the letters. I was left at the estate at one time in Crawford. The Bushes went off to Dallas to their main home, and they said, you can stay here. I mean, the Secret Service was around somewhere, but I was looking at this, I was taking a break, and I was looking at this flag flapping in the wind at the little, this one-hole golf course. And I said, what's that number on that flag? And it was 43. So that was humorous. So we have one more president and one final house on this list, Jimmy Carter. Now, I didn't have quite the lengthy period to know him as I did with George W. Bush, but that was arranged ahead of time. I knew what to expect. And to his credit, he agreed to meet me an hour at his place in Plains, Georgia. So I went down there, whenever it was 6-7 months ago, more, I guess. Also, it seemed to be a very hot time of the year. I always end up in these places in southern Georgia. And he's born in a house that is a mile from where he lives now. He's never left Plains, Georgia, except to go to the White House and the Naval Academy. He's 91 or whatever. Rosalind, his wife, which I discovered, was also born in Plains, Georgia, as I think their parents and grandparents. The fathers built a house, a little bungalow. It looks like a little Sears Roebuck house, very modest. They were not dirt poor by any means, but they're not wealthy. Father was very frugal and didn't feel they should build more than they needed. And they grew crops there on the farm. I think it was pecan trees and sugar and something else. But they had a few barns and whatnot. But no real electricity of any kind, no plumbing. In those parts of the South, up until I think the 40s, there was no infrastructure to bring electricity down. So he grew up in this little house that across the street is a railroad. And when I got to meet Carter at his house, I asked him about that. And he said, I said, what was it like, lying awake and hearing the trains? He says, well, it's very memorable. During the day, we would go out and watch the freight cars go by, and there would sometimes be 200 of these cars. It would take 10 minutes, and we would count them. And he also told me a very touching story that he remembers as a child, was that hobos would get off the train and look for houses where they could get handouts or maybe get a day's pay. And there was a whole system of codes that the hobos would write on people's mailboxes in chalk so that other hobos would see that and know, hey, that's a house that you can go into and they're going to be friendly, or that's a house. And there are all these kind of hieroglyphics. You'd have to research this. There's a house where you can get a day's pay. A day's pay was $1 for a man, 75 cents for a woman, and 50 cents for a teenager, something like that. But one of the things he said was remarkable. He remembers and never forgets it, that some of the people that got off that train were, during the Depression, were former architects, lawyers, doctors, professional people that had no jobs anymore. And his mother, Jimmy Carter's mother, was very open. So this was a house. She was very open to taking people in. This was the house that hobos went to. Little town in, Plains, Georgia, 600 people. You'd say, who in the world would want to spend 91 years? But the whole town was a museum to him. There's the house where he was born, the house where he was moved to, the hospital where he was, born in. All of that is so. It's like Lake Wobegon for Jimmy Carter. This was the first sort of industrialized, mechanical systems that he had for his house, which allowed power to create plumbing. And this, I think, is the last slide, just showing again the simple structure. One little side note, which is fun, just to the right of this house within, as far as this table is from where I am, there's a clay tennis court that has been at that house for 100 years. And you think, does that really compute with this modest house in the middle of Southwest Georgia to have what certainly in those days was a club sport and a sort of an elite kind of thing? Now, of course, it's more democratic, but not so much then. And I said, how did your parents come up with building a clay tennis court right next to the house? He said, it was easy, Adam. All you did was scratch the ground, and the clay was red clay the whole way. And his father was an avid tennis player, and as Jimmy. I don't know if today he is. But it was a great experience. I'll end with this. To meet him, he was sort of the first president that I had become sort of aware of as a real person growing up, because Richard Nixon before him was more of a cartoon character. I used to like to copy the editorial cartoons of him, but Jimmy Carter was someone I followed. And so to see that big smile, exactly the same way as it was on the cover of Time in 1976, was a great experience. And I think that ends the survey of homes. So. Thank you. Well done.
Great.